the future's finite, and that's a big shock to the old system. And it's the existential burden that everyone bears, and it's associated integrally with suffering. And so then you think, well, life is suffering, and it's finite, and that's part of the suffering. That's part of what makes you question the value of existing, and maybe the value of existence itself. So then what do you have to use as a weapon against that? Well, you know, we talked a little bit about responsibility. That seems to work, you know. The amount of responsibility that you adopt in relationship to things seems to increase your meaningful engagement. And you might say, well, what's the most meaningfully engaged activity? And you might say, well, how about a little reduction in the old suffering, you know? So you live your life so that you're not causing undue pain, especially pointless pain. That would be good, and maybe you could even be more useful than that, and you could figure out some ways that some suffering, yours, other people's, both, if you're really, you know, hitting a home run, maybe you can figure out some way that some of that could be rectified. And that seems to be meaningful in and of itself. I mean, if it's pain that makes you doubt the meaning of life, which is perfectly reasonable, then the cessation of pain, the cessation of suffering, the minimization of suffering, as a logical corollary, should be the proper medication. And so I would say that means that there's some mode that you can conduct yourself in that makes you a good person. And part of being a good person is to alleviate suffering. And I don't think you get to question that, actually. If the suffering itself is what's making you question the validity of your life, then you can't also say that the cessation of that is not useful. I mean, you can, but it's completely incoherent. You can claim incoherent things if you want. So then I would say these distilled stories that I'm talking about, the stories that are written, say, by great authors. I'm particularly fond of Dostoevsky, whose works are, he's head and shoulders above anyone I've ever read in terms of writers of fiction. He deals with the hardest questions that human beings face, and he has characters on both sides of the argument, and they really lay out the arguments. It's not like Dostoevsky, you know, he's got a belief, and so he has a character, and that character has his beliefs, and that character always wins the arguments. That doesn't happen in a Dostoevsky novel at all. He sets up a character, and then he sets up like 3 or 4 antagonists, and those antagonists, they're not straw men, they're like iron giants. They just stomp his protagonist, you know, and the whole thing is a war between these different conceptions of being, and it's amazing to see, it's amazing to read. So you distill these stories. Great authors distill stories. Great storytellers distill stories. And we have stories that are very, 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 very old. Those are usually religious stories of one form or another, but they can be fairy tales. Because fairy tales, some people have traced fairy tales back, you know, more than 10,000 years. And so they're part of an oral tradition. And oral traditions can last for tens of thousands of years. And, you know, it's a story that's been told for 10,000 years is a funny kind of story. It's like people have remembered it and obviously modified it. It's like the game of telephone, you know, where I tell you something and you whisper it to the person next to you and so on. It's like a game of telephone that's gone on for, you know, 1,000 generations, and all that's left is what people remember. And maybe they remember what's important, because you tend to remember what's important. And it isn't necessarily the case that you know what the hell it means. You don't know what music means, but, you know, that doesn't stop you from listening to it. You don't know, generally speaking, what a movie that you see or a book that you read means, not if it's profound. It means more than you can understand, because otherwise why read it? Well, so the idea is this, is that we're necessarily nested inside moral systems. The moral systems are predicated on narratives, narrative dramas of sorts, and the moral systems are what orient us in life, and the reason to understand them to the degree that you can is because you need to know how to live. Nietzsche said that if you had a why, you could bear any how, and that's good.
Learn to write. I'm dead serious. Like, I'm dead serious about that, because writing is formalized thinking. And so the way you write is, first of all, you need a problem, because why write if you don't have a problem? So this is good advice if you're just writing an essay, by the way, for your classes. It's like, pick a bloody problem that you want to write about, because otherwise it's false right from the start. It's up to you to engage with the material until you find something that grips you, that you desire to investigate. Okay, so you need a problem. Well, the next thing you need to do is, well, you need to have something to say about the problem. Well, so reading is really good for that. Read as much as you can, get your hands on that addresses the problem. Okay, so now you know a bunch of things, or at least provisionally know them. You at least have access to them. Well, now you start sorting through it. It's like, okay, well, maybe I need to summarize what I've learned, and then I need to iron out the contradictions between what I've learned, and I need to elegantly formulate that, and I need to get my word choice right, and my phrase choice right, and my sentence choice right, and I need to organize the sentences into proper paragraphs, and the paragraphs into proper sequence so that I have a coherent argument. And at the same time, what you're doing is you're integrating your own personality at the highest and most abstract level of organization, and you're sharpening your tools, and you're putting yourself straight because you're learning to think. You learn to do that by writing. And so I would say, pick some hard problems and learn to write very, very carefully. And when I say pay attention to the word, I mean that. Pick the right words. Organize them into the right phrases. Get your sentences straight. Like when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I believe I wrote every sentence in that book 50 times. 50 variants of every sentence. I'd read it once, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, I'd read it again, and I'd have a little competition. Which sentence is better? Which sentence is better?